It was about taking the land, I should say, from Indigenous people by separating the families and paving the way for settlers to encroach on Indigenous people's territories. So, those are not good intentions. It was also about taking language away from the kids, taking culture away from them, trying to civilize them so that they would be put into settler society, transferring children from one group to another. That's genocide. And so, I don't think genocide is ever a good intention.
Kwe Nindeluizi Pam Palmater, and I'm the host of this show, The Warrior Life. I'm an Indigenous lawyer, professor, author, and activist from Eel River Bar First Nation, and my motto is education for action on Indigenous rights, social justice, and protecting the planet. And on this podcast, you're going to get an education of a different kind. It's one that's enriched by the cultures and insights and lived experiences of Indigenous authors, artists, musicians, academics, but also leaders and activists and land defenders, water protectors, all of us who are on the front lines of Indigenous resistance, resurgence, and revitalization. And that's not always an easy job. And I just want to caution listeners that today's podcast could be a little bit upsetting to some of those who have been directly impacted by Indian residential schools. So stay tuned. We have some very important updates on the issue of missing children and unmarked graves. To the Warrior Life podcast. I'm your host, Pam Palmater. And because we're approaching fall, it's the lead up to the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I thought it'd be really important for us to have an update on what's happening on the issue of missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites. So on today's podcast, we're going to be getting a very important update from someone who has been working on this for a very, very long time. She is one of the most amazing people I know. The work that she does is absolutely incredible. It's so important. And I don't even think the world knows what kind of sacrifice it is when you put yourself out there in the public to people who are not very friendly to Indigenous peoples to work on issues like this. And so I'm very thankful to have Kim Murray here. She is the independent Special Interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools. Thank you so much for being here, Kim Murray. She's, like I said, one of the most educated and experienced lawyers that I know. In addition to having a BA and a law degree and a master's in law, she was also awarded the designation of Indigenous Peoples Council from the Indigenous Bar Association. And she literally has decades and decades of experience working with Indigenous communities on very sensitive issues, which I think really helps inform her current role. She's served both as staff lawyer and executive director of Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto, where she acted as legal counsel in some coroner's inquests and public inquiries, including the Ipperwash inquiry in Ontario, which some of you will recall was about the killing of unarmed land defender Dudley George by the Ontario Provincial Police, the OPP, and also the Frank Paul inquiry in British Columbia, which investigated the freezing death of a member of my nation, the Mi'kmaq Nation, Frank Paul, after he was drug into an alley by police and froze to death. So these are very sensitive and important issues. And of course, some of you will probably recognize her from her previous role as the executive director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, where her big purpose was to make sure that survivors of Canada's Indian residential schools were heard and honored, and that we could educate Canadians and work towards reconciliation. Thank you so much for coming back onto the Warrior Life podcast, Special Interlocutor Kim.
Thank you, Pam. I'm really appreciative of you inviting me here today to give updates. And
Before we get into it, I want to let listeners know that there is a 24-hour National Indian Residential School crisis line, 1-866-925-4419. And there are other lines and other supports, and I will post all of those in the description box so that you have easy access. Kim, I want to say again, I really appreciate you coming onto the show. I know you're incredibly busy, but I wanted to have you back because so many of our listeners and our cousins and friends on social media have been asking an awful lot of questions. And I know we've had you on the show before. We've talked about all your background and your previous inquiries. So we're not going to repeat that today, listeners. If you want to know that, you can listen to the previous episode. And again, I'll post the links in case you want to catch up. But Kim, I'm hoping it's okay if we can just start right at the beginning. And I think it's probably best to say, where you're from, what your mandate is, and what's been happening since your appointment before I get into all the reports.
Absolutely. So, Sego, I'm Kimberly Murray. I am the Independent Special Interlocutor for Missing Children in Unmarked Graves. I'm a Mohawk and a member of Kanehsatà Mohawk Nation. And as Pam indicated, I'm a lawyer and have the great responsibility, sacred responsibility of working with communities that are searching for the missing and disappeared children in the unmarked graves. So I was appointed for 2 years, and my mandate got extended for an extra 6 months. So I am going to be in this role until December of 2024, and I plan to release a final report in October. Canada, after Kamloops made the announcement of the unmarked burials that they recovered at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, immediately said they were going to appoint a special interlocutor. And they've asked me to speak to communities that are searching for the children in the unmarked burials, to hear from them directly about the barriers that they're facing, about the problems that they're encountering, and to make recommendations for a new legal framework moving forward. So that's what I've been doing in the last over 2 years, is going to communities, visiting with the survivors, hearing from them about the work that they're doing, and the big challenges that they're facing as they try and find all the unmarked burials.
It seems like this issue just keeps going. So you've got residential schools, you've got the long-lasting impacts, intergenerational impacts of Indian residential schools, and it just seems there's always something to be doing in the face of sometimes not always a really welcoming public or media commentary, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I wanted to give people a sense of, since like you were on my podcast 2 years ago, so we're approaching almost 2 years, I should say. And so I wanted to talk about some of the reports that have been released, and some of them are like summaries of national gatherings, some of them are progress reports, interim reports, but some of them deal with very particular issues. Obviously, you're dealing with all of them, but for example, there's a report that is entitled like Addressing Trauma. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And just so the listeners understand, as I was conducting my mandate, it was really important that I sit with survivors and communities to hear directly from them about the challenges they're facing. And so in addition to going into communities and going to survivor gatherings, I have hosted 6 national gatherings across the country where communities and teams that are doing the searches attended. Some of these national gatherings were general in nature, where we covered a number of different topics. Others were specific to a topic that I was hearing over and and over again as I went into communities. And so community wellness and addressing the trauma that communities are facing is one of the main concerns that I hear as I've been doing my work. So the summary report about addressing trauma is a summary of the national gathering we hosted in Winnipeg. We heard that this trauma of not knowing what happened to our family members, our loved ones, our missing and disappeared children is a different type of trauma that has to be addressed, that has to be supported by the federal government with proper services and funding so that communities can actually engage with the service providers that they want to, whether that's elders or wellness supports that are Indigenous controlled and Indigenous led. We heard at that gathering how the current colonial health system is actually causing more harm to communities and individuals than helping. So that report focuses on that need to change how Indigenous peoples and communities can access proper wellness supports. Because, you know, the government of Canada at the beginning of funding communities told them that they couldn't use funding to have health supports on their teams of the people that are doing ground searches. And so we know, you know, issues of vicarious trauma there's all kinds of grief that's happening, this not knowing whether you're going to find a burial, and if you find a burial, how we're going to resolve the issues that communities are discussing. Do we exhume them or don't we exhume them? And so it's really important that everyone gets taken care of. And also the spirits of the children need to be cared for in specific ways. And the families, you know, it breaks my heart. You know, we have families that want to exhume their child and bring them back home to their community, and Canada is refusing to provide funding, and the provinces are refusing to provide funding for that to happen. And requiring families to prove that the child died at the Indian residential school as opposed to they died in the Indian hospital when they were transferred to the hospital. So we have a lot of work to do in this country, and Canada continues to sort of, as I say to the survivors and elders, continues to bubble wrap itself, continues to protect itself, continues to create this culture of impunity, amnesty for itself in this country. And you know, I think through the reports, and in particular the report that I released this summer, Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience, is really about putting the more truths out there so that people can't deny that these harms, these massive human rights atrocities occurred. You know, and the TRC full report is evidence that these crimes occurred, that these atrocities happened, these massive human rights breaches happened. So I just really trying to contribute to what we've already known and do it in different ways so that Canadians can see for themselves when they read the reports and they hear from the survivors and when they see the photographs and the images that are contained in the Sites of Truth volume.
It's so important, you know, because this is beyond, this is not about religion. It's not about political rhetoric. It's not about personal opinions. This is all fact-based, you know, the facts that were found in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the facts that were found in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the facts that were found in the National Inquiry into Murder to Missing. And now, you know, you're also gathering facts from people saying, hey, I know this happened, or I know this in this location. So this isn't about agendas. This is about facts. This is about lived experiences. This is about, like, to me, this is bare minimum justice. Really, are you going to argue semantics about whether they died in the school, outside the school, after the school, in the Indian hospital, in the jails, in the day school you transferred? That, like, to me, that none of that is really relevant. It's the fact that that whole system is what led to their deaths ultimately. And so I'm really glad that you, like, I know you cover these issues in all of your, you know, national gatherings and in the locations that you're at, but that you also take time to address those particular things, like addressing trauma. And one of the other ones I thought was really, really important was Indigenous laws involved in all of this, because I don't think that's been a big discussion, on the media forefront. So can you talk a little bit about your report that talked about the importance of Indigenous laws in all of this?
Absolutely. So that we held a gathering in Toronto on the revitalization of Indigenous laws and how to implement Indigenous laws in the search and recovery efforts that communities are doing across the country. Um, when you review that summary report, you will see how teams and communities and survivors are incorporating their own laws and protocols as they start and conduct the searches, and how they engage with one another on nation to nation basis. Because as we know, many children were brought to Indian residential schools from many, many different communities. And so the communities where the burials are located are having to engage and have dialogues with 30, 40, 50 different First Nations and make decisions according to Indigenous laws and protocols around what the next steps are. Those difficult decisions around, are we going to protect the grounds, or are we going to exhume the bodies? Are we going to do DNA testing? And who's going to hold the data from the records that they're collecting? Who's going to hold the data of DNA? And so all that has to be, those decisions have to be made according to Indigenous protocols, Indigenous laws. It takes time. It takes time for those decisions to be made. And I know that Canadians are asking, why is it taking so long? Why don't we know what's happening? What's happening in Kamloops? Are they going to exhume those bodies? Canadians need to be patient because these are really, really difficult discussions that are happening and that need to happen. And there's, just like in all societies, there's difference of opinions on what should happen, and communities and groups of communities need to come together and resolve these differences that they have in their protocols. And so Indigenous laws have to form everything. And my mandate is to make recommendations for a new legal framework to protect the burial grounds. No surprise, I'm going to be saying Indigenous laws have to be included in that. This is not about colonial laws. It has to be Indigenous laws. And we know the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People recognizes and upholds the right for Indigenous people to have their own legal systems. And so I will be recommending how Indigenous laws need to lead this framework, for a new framework to protect the burial grounds. We know Canadian laws, colonial laws, provincial laws, federal laws have not done the job. I will be, in my final report, listing all the examples of Indigenous burial grounds that have been desecrated in this country, and no legal action has been taken against the companies or the individuals that desecrated those graves. Nobody's been prosecuted for those crimes. And as you spoke about, Pam, about Ipperwash, we were dealing with a burial ground. My own community, Kanehsatà, we were dealing with a burial ground. And look at what happened when Indigenous people weren't able to exercise their jurisdiction, their sovereignty, and their laws to protect those burial grounds. My final report will be speaking a lot about that.
So important, because when you think about it, there's been questions that I've seen in the media around, okay, well, federal and provincial jurisdiction, and how are we going to resolve that conflict? And I'm thinking, okay, wait, what about the Indigenous laws? We talk a lot about supporting self-government. We have Section 35, protection of self-government, making our own laws. We've got now UNDRIP that supports our own laws. Like, when do we have this conversation around, okay, well, you know what? There's another legal system that we need to take into account here. It's not just federal and provincial. It's not just issues related to municipalities and what about their bylaws, or individual people and their, companies. Maybe they have, large swaths of land that they use for different purposes, especially large corporations. So I think it's so important that we're having this discussion around Indigenous laws because it really should be paramount at the end of the day. Like you were saying, one family might want something in a community, but maybe the community wants something different. Or maybe there's large extended families who are saying, hey, we're not quite sure. And they have their own processes for working that out. And really, who is Canada to say what our timeline is for resolving all of that? It's been a long, hard process. That just the fact that, we're only now getting to your work and what you're doing, despite the fact that the TRC had a whole chapter on missing children and unmarked graves. So I think that's important. Now, one of the things you were talking about in terms of Indigenous laws, and I saw in one of your reports, is data sovereignty. So can you just explain that a little bit for people who maybe don't know exactly what that is and the kind of work that Indigenous peoples are doing just in general on data sovereignty, but in particular with regards to the very sensitive information that could be disclosed in this process?
Yeah, absolutely. At the Vancouver National Gathering, we focused on the need for Indigenous data sovereignty. And, Indigenous data sovereignty is about getting the data back, right? When we say land back, we also say data back. It's really important that all these colonial institutions, the Library and Archives Canada, the federal government, universities, provincial governments, have all been recording and taking information from Indigenous people, collecting and gathering, documenting our histories. And they hide them in their colonial archives where communities can't access them because of laws like the access to information laws and privacy laws. We also know that the churches are hiding records from communities and house records about communities and our families. And they're hiding behind laws that don't even apply to them. The church entities will say, we can't provide those records to you because of privacy. Well, the privacy law doesn't apply to church entities, actually. The privacy laws only apply to the government entities. And so what the churches are doing, which is very disturbing, is that they're telling communities, oh, all the records were given to the TRC, and they're now at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is protected by provincial law, which means you have to go through the provincial law of Manitoba to access your records that were never were already available from the churches. So I think it's important for people to understand that the churches didn't give the original copies of their records to the TRC. They gave copies. So they're still sitting on community records and individual records. That's really important that you approach the churches because they have to provide those records to you. So the thing about data back, Indigenous data sovereignty, it's about who controls the data, who has access to the data, who has possession of the data. And when I say data, when it comes to the children and the unmarked burials, yes, it's the Indian residential school records, it's the Indian hospital records, it's the church records that, recorded all these life experience, all these life events, births, deaths, marriages. It's the transfers that happened of the children between all this big web of institutions that the kids were transferred between. And once we have the data back, it'll be Indigenous laws, Indigenous peoples that will determine how to store that data in a respectful way, how to describe that information in ways that come from a different lens. Because remember, these records were created by settlers, by colonial settlers. And so they're very disturbing to read, which goes back to the need for wellness supports. But we need to take back the narrative. We need to make sure that these records about our families and our communities are in our control and in our possession.
So important. And I think one of the things that comes out in these gatherings and in your reports and just in our conversation right here are all of the different locations. I think there is this misunderstanding that, oh, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, they gathered, they have all of the documents and, that should be case closed. But that report itself said, hey, we don't have all the documents. And then you think about, okay, wait, churches and federal and provincial governments, There may be some municipalities, there could be libraries, museums, hospitals, jails, adoption agencies. Like there's just so many places where our kids who were in Indian residential schools were shifted back and forth, back and forth. And there's records that, you know, we don't even know we have. And some of it, I'm sure it's just awful, awful information. And it really should be up to Indigenous communities like to have all that information. It's our history. So when I hear in the media that the federal government wants to destroy some documents and that there's a court proceeding over that, like, can you talk a little bit more about that? I can't imagine that documents would be destroyed that belong to Indigenous peoples.
Well, I mean, you know, I always have to remind people that the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement only required the federal government departments and the church entities that signed on to the settlement agreement to provide records to the TRC. And the TRC had enormous problems trying to get the records from these entities. The Catholic Church was the biggest offender that didn't comply with the settlement agreement when we look at the records. And the TRC had to go to court to get the records out of the Library and Archives Canada. And so, Pam, as you said, it's not just those entities that have records, it's all these other entities. And when I worked at the TRC, I tried to get other colonial governments, other institutions to provide records to the TRC. We worked with coroners' offices, we worked with the registrar generals to try and get death certificates from all the provinces and territories. All of them didn't comply or reply to my request. I went to numerous universities, McGill University to name one of them, U of T, asking them to look in their archives because we know that people that worked, professors that worked at universities were involved in medical experimentation on the children at Indian residential schools. We know that universities in their archives have records about Indigenous people, about all the studies. And so I encourage universities to do their own work of reconciliation. And before, you know, everyone wants to get to the reconciliation part and forget the truth part, but they need to, you know, identify the truth of how their institutions were involved in the creation of the Indian residential schools and the Indian hospitals, and how they benefited from the fact that they were doing illegal, contrary to international law, experimentations on Indigenous children in all kinds of institutions. So, you know, it's the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which house the records from the TRC. They don't have all these other institutional records. They haven't tried to get them. They're not getting them. You know, and so part of this, you know, when I said earlier that Canada has bubble wrapped itself, Canada has created this culture of impunity, amnesty in this country. Just look at me. I was appointed. I have no powers. I have no powers to get records. Look at the TRC settlement agreement. They had no powers to get records, right? Well, it's about time Canada gives people powers to get records from these organizations and institutions, because they've shown over and over again that they're not willing to contribute to reconciliation by opening up their archives. And, you know, we have a long way, a lot more truths that are going to come out as these archives, as people find ways into these archives so that we can have some data sovereignty over these records.
And it really is the truth. Canadians deserve the truth. We deserve the truth. It's our quest for facts. We just want fact-based information. And I think of all of the abuses that have been done and continue to be done, to be honest, that would be the bare minimum. And I know some universities or hospitals or governments might be like, oh, you know, it's not going to make us look too good when they find out we were doing this, or we have records of some pretty awful things. But that's what reconciliation is. It's uncomfortable, it's painful, but it's also accountability. We're not going to get to reconciliation unless we do all of that uncomfortable work. I mean, look at Toronto Sick Kids. It's a world-renowned hospital. Everybody loves Toronto Sick Kids. Everybody fundraises for it. But they had to hold themselves to account for some of the experimentation that was done there on Indigenous kids to benefit other kids. And I think more and more institutions need to do that. It's great that they're doing land acknowledgements. I think it's great that they're hiring more Native people. It's great that they're having, more Native artwork and things like that. But we also have to do all the really, really painful stuff. And I'm so glad you're doing the work that you're doing, because maybe you can clarify this, but I heard in the media that there was going to be no more money for this missing children and unmarked burials, but then there is going to be money. Like one day they're reporting no, and the next day they're reporting yes. Can you just clarify what happened there? Like, was this going to be the end of your mandate?
Well, first of all, the money, just so people understand, I'm actually appointed under the Department of Justice as the Special Interlocutor, and I'm not under, the Indian agent, as I like to still say. So the funding for communities comes from Crown Indigenous Relations. And so, as always, the government seems to work in isolation and in silos. And so CIRNAC, or Crown Indigenous Relations, originally started the program, as they call it. And I have a big problem that it's a program, because Canada has international legal obligations to support these searches, and we shouldn't be treating them as programs. But when they first started funding communities to do searches, there was a $5 million cap that communities had per year to support the work of doing ground searches, research, collecting statements from survivors. Then they reduced that cap to $3 million. And then recently, without telling communities, and it got leaked, communities heard that CIRNAC was cutting the funding to $500,000 a year. And so we have many, many communities that haven't even started the ground searches yet. And so in typical government fashion, they held an emergency Zoom meeting and invited all the communities that had applied for funding onto a Zoom meeting where you couldn't forward the Zoom link. So only the people invited were allowed to come. I wasn't invited. I couldn't get the Zoom link because no one could forward it to me. And people came on the Zoom meeting and no one was allowed to ask questions. They were all muted. And CIRNAC presented information about the new funding levels. And so with the advocacy, again, of survivors and Indigenous communities, they fought back. And you'll see, I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago on Friday afternoon, they quietly issued a press release apologizing for their error and said that they lifted the cap. What was really problematic about the cap was that it wasn't only a cap on how much money you got, but it was also told communities what they could use the money for. And that was to do statement gathering, ground searches, and that was it, or archival research. So you weren't able to use the funding for memorialization or commemoration. You wouldn't be able to use the funding to do exhumations. You wouldn't be able to use the funding to protect the grounds by putting up a fence. So, it was just, I don't know who gives advice to the government, but it was really bad advice and a serious misstep. I've yet to see what, they've lifted the cap of 500,000. It's now 3 million again per year. And I'm not clear on what activities communities are able to use that funding for. Because remember, it's not just about the ground searches and statement gathering archival records. There's all these other pieces. How do you build a database for all those records? That, for your Indigenous data sovereignty, to protect them and make sure that they're preserved. What do we do if families want to bring their children back home to their home communities? How do they pay for that? Right now, nobody's funding that. Canada used to say they would fund it. I tell of a couple of stories or experiences of families that are fighting to bring home their loved ones, or had wanted to bring home their loved ones, only to find that they're in mass graves with 28 other children. And until we know who the other 28 children, we can't disturb that grave for that one family to bring their loved one home. There's examples of that all over the country, and this is going to take like, this is going to not take a year. This is going to take a decade or more to get to all the truths that are out there.
Oh, of course. And I think, about the confusion that some Canadians might have that this residential school is located in this area, so it must only be kids from that First Nation, when in fact there are some residential schools that might have Métis kids, might have First Nation kids, might have Inuit kids, and from different areas. So it's not even like one community is the one that can make decisions around some of those things. And so this is time intensive and very sensitive when you think about it. Um, so, Kim, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you today is because since we last talked, I mean, denialism and racism has always been out there. We know that. But since the last time we've talked, it feels like residential school denialism in various forms has just been increasing in terms of, hate mail and what's posted on social media and websites and books and people in leadership positions, academics. Just it seems like it's coming on full speed ahead, and that's making this whole process much more difficult. I mean, obviously it's difficult for activists and advocates and people that are working in this area, but for the families, it's absolutely devastating. And I open this podcast with, this has really got to be about the facts, this conversation. This can't be about what you wish it was or what you wish it wasn't, or kind of deny the bad things that have happened. And so I'm wondering if you have a little bit of time that I can post some of the common myths and misconceptions or things that denialists are saying, so that we put the facts out there. Is that something that we could do?
Sure.
Okay. Well, one of the first things that I've seen in the media was that these denialists are saying, I don't know why you're upset about these residential schools. They're just boarding schools. Lots of kids go to boarding schools. I mean, some of the wealthiest families have kids going to boarding schools. I mean, I feel like I know the answer to this, but for anyone who's listening and doesn't have any background, can you respond to this really ignorant kind of comment?
Oh, well, there's so many responses to that. First off, it wasn't legislated that white kids had to go to boarding schools, and that it was illegal, and you would be put in jail and you would be fined and you would, be rations wouldn't be provided to you, and you would be threatened, and the RCMP would come after you and take your kids. I mean, it was the law to apprehend the children and put them in these institutions. And the purpose of the institution wasn't to educate them. It was to, as the well-coined term, to kill the Indian in the child. While in those boarding schools, if you want to call them that, they were required to work. They were human trafficked out of those institutions to work on settler farms. Women, the young girls were trafficked out into places like Muskoka in the summertime to be placed in homes of settlers, and who knows what harms happened there. Those things did not happen in settler boarding schools, in boarding schools where white people went. And, I encourage everyone to look at my Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience report, because you will see that Canada planned these institutions knowing that kids were going to be killed and died in these institutions, because they mapped out the area where the graves were going to be, where the cemeteries were going to be. They're all on the blueprints of the institutions. You show me one settler boarding school that was created with a cemetery attached to it. If a kid died in a settler boarding school, they were sent home. Their families were called immediately, and they were buried according to their family's customs and traditions and where the family wanted them to be buried. That is not the case what happened with Indigenous children and Indigenous families. So, I mean, we could have a whole podcast on the differences. And these children were placed in these institutions and told what religion that they were gonna follow, where settlers, they put their children in boarding schools run by the religious entity that they chose to put their children in. Those children got to come home on weekends. Those children got to come home on holidays. And that was not the case for Indigenous kids. And those parents got to visit their children. Indigenous families were not able to, with the law stopping them, or the policy, with the pass system and all kinds of all kinds of legal mechanisms, and the RCMP stopping families from being able to take their kids home out of these places.
Yeah. Everything you said, I was just, it makes me so angry every time I hear this, because honestly, there's 1,000 other things you could say literally. And I look at the difference between what some of these very posh private boarding schools are able to say. Look at all of the wonderful things we provide, all of the opportunities, and look at our graduates. They've gone on to become prime ministers or premiers or, Fortune 500 people. Like the very, very, very different outcomes. And so I'm really glad that you answered that one, because I hate hearing that over and over and over again. Okay. So one of the other things that we hear them say is, wait a second, how can you call this genocide or human rights abuse? Governments and churches, they had really good intentions. All of this education was good for them. They learned new skills. And, with rare exceptions, this was better for Native people. It helped civilize them.
Well, I would challenge whether it was good intentions, because it's very clear in the historical record. It was about taking the land, I should say, from Indigenous people by separating the families and paving the way for settlers to encroach on Indigenous people's territories. So, those are not good intentions. It was also about taking language away from the kids, taking culture away from them, trying to civilize them so that they would be put into settler society, transferring children from one group to another. That's genocide. And so, I don't think genocide is ever a good intention. And clearly, these institutions were not created with good intentions. And the facts speak for themselves. The kids weren't being educated. They were working and having to work the farms. They were being abused. They were being worked out, as I said earlier, into settler farms. And very little education was happening in these institutions. So where did your good intentions go then, churches? Because you weren't educating individuals. They were using the kids to make money for the institutions to keep them employed and to keep the institution running. They were fighting amongst themselves to try and get the most kids into their institutions so that they could get a bigger per diem from the government of Canada so that they can run these organizations. So, there were no good intentions. There might have been some good people inside the institutions. I've heard that. From survivors, that they remember that one nun or that one teacher that that was on contract that helped them. But for the most part, they were not. It was all bad experience for most of the children.
Well, and you just only need to look at the government record. It was to kill the Indian in the child. It was when information is being brought forward saying, hey, you've got thousands of kids dying in these schools. And it's like, yep, but that's no justification to change the policy, because what is our intentions? What's our policy? The final solution to the Indian problem. So there's just so much information and facts, even from government records, that simply just doesn't stand up. But residential school denialists are very persistent, and they say, well, hey, what about Joe Blow, who says nothing bad ever happened to him and he had a great time in residential school? So you're forgetting about balance and to talk about all of the great experiences that kids had, and that these bad things were just exceptions.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would point to the facts that when the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was signed, it was estimated that there were approximately 80,000 survivors alive at the time. And all we have to look at is how many of those 80,000 survivors that were alive at the time of the settlement agreement that applied for, went to adjudication, and proved that they were sexually or physically abused in those institutions. 49,000 of them. So the numbers indicate these were not nice places. So the Pollyannas that say that they were great places and nothing bad ever happened in this institution, the independent assessment process proves otherwise. And just imagine of all those survivors that didn't have the ability to apply for compensation because they they couldn't get themselves to speak about the trauma and the harm that happens to them, or those people that weren't alive at the time of the settlement agreement. We know that the abuse was rampant in the institutions. Physical, sexual, spiritual abuse were rampant. And we just need to look at the government's own records, the government and church's own records from their adjudication process that said, yes, this individual was physically and sexually abused in the institution.
Honestly, and then I think of people like St. Anne's, the First Nations impacted by St. Anne's, who can't even get the records to be able to prove what happened. So aside from people not surviving, aside from people who just mentally cannot go through that process, or people who've been denied wrongfully because there wasn't enough documented evidence of all of these things, that the numbers are likely much higher, and that's just the numbers that we know. So I think those facts are super important. Now, one of the most disgusting things I hear from residential school denialists, and I hate to even bring it up, because on the one hand, I don't like to give them any air, any oxygen, but at the same time, I want Canadians to have the answers, because it's just leaving misinformation out there. And I've heard them say, listen, uh we have this whole missing children, unmarked graves and burials process going. It's all a sham. Show me the bodies.
Yeah.
I want to see pictures of the bodies if this actually happened. So, first of all, that's so horribly morbid and disrespectful and traumatizing to even want that kind of horrible information.
Yeah.
But second of all, how do you respond to people who say, I'm not going to believe it until I see the bodies myself?
Yeah, it is, as you say, disgusting and morbid. So I often will say to settlers, well, I live, near a cemetery. Well, let's go into the cemetery down the road and dig up your ancestor and your family member and see if there's an actual body in that grave.
Yeah.
And of course, no one's going to say, sure, do it, sure, do it. So what I encourage Canadians to do, again, read the report I released in June, because it has the documentary proof, it has the images. A lot of this the TRC cited in their volume on missing children. And so I'm making it really easy for you, making it really easy for Canadians. There's hyperlinks. You can zoom in and read for yourself. There are death certificates of many children that say they died at the Indian Residential School and they're buried in the Indian Residential School cemetery. There are the maps and the blueprints that show where the cemetery was. There are records and letters between principals and Indian agents that the cemetery's full and we need to start burying the kids across the laneway. There's so much evidence. And there are pictures. And this was, Pam, a really difficult decision for me, because there's about 3 or 4 very sensitive photographs that I put in my report in June that are of children in cemeteries, digging the graves, working in the cemetery grounds. And I spoke to the survivors and I spoke to elders about whether to put this in the report. And they said the time has come that we have to show these photos. There are others. There are others there are photos of children in coffins with the coffin open. But we shouldn't have to put that on the front page of the Globe and Mail to prove any further that children died in these institutions. They're buried on these institutional grounds. They're also buried in cemeteries all over the country, in mass graves and unmarked graves that Canada paid for and put the children in those graves. And, the evidence is there. There's no disputing it in my mind. So, the deniers can keep putting out misinformation and disinformation, but the records speak the truth. The survivors speak the truth. And, just don't be lazy, Canadians. I was reminded by Murray Sinclair when we had dinner a couple months ago that the TRC wanted to arm the reasonable with its report. It wanted to make sure Canadians understood the truth and provide the information they needed. And, the TRC said in its final report that there's an urgent need to have historically literate citizens. And that's the importance of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. For citizens to become historically literate, to understand the history, to do the work that they need to do to have the information so they know what's misinformation and what's disinformation that's being put out by the deniers.
And I think that's the majority of Canadians, that like this whole thing, that the small number of deniers who are already racist and hateful and disgusting and traumatizing, there's always going to be a small number of them, but Canadians shouldn't let that influence them learning history, them learning the facts, because there's always going to be conspiracy theorists who say the earth is flat, or that we're all invaded by lizard men and all of these silly things. But to be honest, it's really important to read these things and learn the facts. And I guess my last question to you really is around, we talked about how your mandate is to identify, locate, protect, repatriate, and commemorate these Indigenous children who died because of Indian residential schools, whether they were in it, out of it, graduated from it, transferred, whatever. My big concern is when I see people on social media saying, oh yeah, well, we're going to go and find these areas and dig it up ourselves. And you've seen groups of people posting pictures of themselves with shovels, threatening to go and dig up our ancestors. How on earth do we protect our ancestors, these children and families, from this kind of trauma, which is for drama, really, which is for them to get memberships on their hateful websites or to be able to write a book about it? How do we protect this?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is we have to rematriate the land to Indigenous communities and put the lands where the ancestors are buried in control of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And I also think, we have laws against this stuff, but Canada and the police services and the provinces have, don't prosecute, don't apply their own laws. And so we need to strengthen the legal system, the colonial legal system, and maybe have Indigenous people in charge of how to proceed and go after the individuals that are doing the desecration of the graves. I mentioned that, my final report will show the many, many examples of where Indigenous ancestors have not been protected by the Canadian state. And so, a lot of communities and survivors are asking for a similar legislation that we have, that exists in the United States, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. There's a lot of problems with that legislation, a lot of problems. And it doesn't rematriate land. It doesn't give land back to communities. And so we can build on that legislation possibly in Canada, but there's a lot more that we need to do. And, importantly, Canada signed on to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. The Supreme Court of Canada recently, in the Quebec reference case, for the first time said that UNDRIP is law, at least in relation to child welfare. And so we need to do the work and get Canada to live up to its obligations under the UN Declaration, under many, many other declarations and conventions that it has signed to comply with their obligations that they have. And that would include Indigenous people having control over the ancestors and the burial grounds.
So important. So important. I think of like, how many more ways can we traumatize Indigenous peoples? Like, is enough not enough? And so I'm glad that the majority of Canadians are trying to learn more, trying to support, push governments to do better. Kim, I can't thank you enough for coming here. And I know people are going to say, if I say goodbye without asking you what's next, what's on the schedule, we have this most recent report, Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience. What's happening in the next few months while you wrap up your mandate?
Yeah, I'm hosting our final gathering, national gathering, on October 29th and 30th. I will be releasing my recommendations for the new legal framework on October 29th. It is going to be live streamed and webcast, so I encourage everyone to go to our website and watch that day. Following the release of my final report, I'm meeting with governments and Indigenous leadership and survivors and survivor groups to explain the recommendations and to hear more inputs around them, and to really work with communities about how do we strategize to make sure that these recommendations, obligations get implemented by government. Because as we all know, 94 calls to action, 231 calls for justice, the Royal Commission of Aboriginal People, so many recommendations aren't being implemented. And that's why, for me, when I think about, I'm now encouraging, and I write about this in my final report, these children are missing, but they've also been disappeared by the state. And that has significant legal consequences and puts a number of obligations on the state to support communities in doing the investigations to find the disappeared children. And we need to make sure that the international community understands that Canada is not the human rights abiding country that it likes to portray itself at the UN, the United Nations. And so I explain in great detail in my final report how Canada is not complying with its international human rights obligations under many, many of the conventions that it signed on to.
Thank you so much, Kim, for doing this. I really appreciate it that you help answer all of our questions, and I'll make sure to post links to everything. Make sure you share this far and wide. Use it in your classrooms. Always follow the facts. Don't listen to the deniers. Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you, Pam.
Till next time, keep living a warrior life. Walalia.